Hey, Prankster Man here. This is video update of 10SI, 12SI alternators. I figured out what the problem was with testing the alternator, where proving that the stator modification works. The problem was RPMs. Basically, the engine was spinning just off of idle. The engine probably was spinning at say about 1,000 RPMs, which made the alternator spin at 1,000 RPMs. When you're testing the alternator, you want to take in consideration of rotor RPM compared to engine RPM. That's done through ratios from the crank pulley and the alternator pulley. My APU has a setup of 1:1, so basically for every 1,000 RPMs of the engine, the alternator is spinning 1,000 RPMs, which is not very good. It's spinning slow compared to it being in a car. I measured the pulleys in my Jeep. The crank pulley is 7 inches and the alternator pulley is about 2.5 inches. There's at least 2.5, 2.75 to 3:1 ratio. So the engine is spinning at 1,000 RPMs. The alternator is spinning at around 1,000, 2.5. Rounded off to 2.5 ratio, 2,500. Those 10SI, 12SI alternators, full output is at 3,000 RPMs, which means about 1,250 engine RPMs on the tachometer. So that's around cruising speed, doing about 25. That's when the alternator is putting out the maximum amperage. Basically, I did the 1:1 ratio on my APU because I needed the horsepower to spin the alternator. If I wanted the alternator to spin at 1,000 RPMs, that engine redlines at 1,000 RPMs, which is revved up all the way. When you take in consideration of the ratios, APU is 1:1, and it takes 1 horsepower to spin 27 amps out of the alternator. I needed the horsepower to spin the alternator. With the 1:1 ratio, if I had a ratio 3:1, the engine would have to be putting out 60 amps. It's about 3 horsepower, 2.5 ratio, multiply it by 2.5, about 8 horsepower. That's a 6 horsepower Tecumseh. I wouldn't have had enough of horsepower to spin the alternator when it was full output, and it would drag the engine down and in turn lower the amperage of the alternator, which is the problem that's going on right now. So to prove that the stator modification works, I can't do it basically because I don't have a baseline of the stator in its original configuration before I switched it over. I did the test at engine when it was just off of idle, which was about 1,000 RPM, which was spinning the alternator at 1,000 RPM, which was 30 amps. After I did the stator modification, that same RPM on the engine brought the amps down a couple, which was around 27 amps, which is normal when you do that basic modification to the stator. You lose a little bit of amperage at low RPM, but you gain a ton of amps at high RPM. I got it set up right now on my Jeep. I'm going to rev the engine as high as it'll go, and then full field it, it should vary the amp meter past 60. It's a 63 amp alternator maximum in its original configuration, but it should vary the needle past 60, which would basically prove that the modification works. So let's go outside and we'll test the alternator. Okay, before we get to testing, I want to show you the setup on my Jeep for the alternator. I don't know if you can see it. Measuring the crank pulley. Crank pulley measures at about 7 inches. And then the alternator pulley is, where are you at? It's about 2.5 inches. Then the setup on my APU, but basically the same. There we go. Two and a half. About 2.5. So test it and full field it, and you'll see what the outcome will be. It was close, it was about 55, 60, but that's the gist of it. Okay, just got done doing the test. The test showed 55, 50 amps with the engine revved up. I couldn't rev the engine up any higher, hold the camera, and full field the alternator. I don't have a third hand, so I think it was a successful test. Proves that the stator modification works. The alternator works fine the way it's wired up now. I'm just sorry I couldn't come up with a baseline with the alternator spin as fast as the engine was to prove unconditionally that the modification works. But it does work. It does make the alternator put out more. I hope you try it. Wiring diagrams of my APU and the stator modification were in at the end of number 3 video. To get a copy of it, all you have to do is pause the video and then use your snipping tool and take a snip of it. That's all the time I'm going to spend on the subject. If you have any questions or any comments, You know what to do. Like it, hate it. I guess that's it. Price demand. Bye.